Hey guys, welcome back to Planet Mithril, and today we're going to be doing something slightly different on the channel for you guys. We are going to be showing you how to paint the great eagles of Middle-earth. Majestic beasts ever faithful to their Istari companions. We'll be using a lot of dry brushing and a lot of feathering and a lot of techniques that are best suited to a model of this sort, which has got a lot of very defined feathers, which aren't necessarily conducive to fine edge highlighting, because we're not going to edge highlight every single feather on this eagle. But as always, we started by assembling our model and mold line cleaning it, getting rid of all of the mold lines all over the model. We assembled our model with plastic glue. The model was not affixed to the base. We did assemble the flying peg to the flying base. The base will be sanded and painted later on in the tutorial. But once the model was glued together and dried, we primed it with Citadel Chaos Black spray, and once that was dry, we're ready to paint. The model's a bit of a tricky one to paint, as we can't affix it to anything like a painting handle to keep it stable, so we had to very carefully balance it while we're painting it and make sure we're not putting blemishes on previously painted areas once we're holding it to paint other areas. So while you're painting this model, just be aware that you've got to be very careful and very delicate, but also firm to make sure it doesn't go flying off out your hands while you're painting, especially with the dry brushing we're going to be doing. But without further delay, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. First, we're going to use pure Rhinox hide and apply a thorough base coat to the main body of the eagle. This includes the front feathers on the wings, the main body of the torso, around the neck, and both the legs. You can thin this down slightly and apply this in a couple of thin layers to get a nice smooth finish, making sure to get in all the creases and crevices between all the feathers. Now we're going to use a mix of Rhinox hide and Scrag brown and layer over all the brown feathers once again. This will bring the tone up to a nice, rich, almost chocolatey brown, which will be really effective when working off for our later layers and highlighting stages. Now the eagle's really awkward to hold whilst dry brushing and painting. We tried to affix it to a freestanding feature for ease of painting, but because of the claws and everywhere that we need to paint, it wasn't really doable. So just make sure when you're holding the eagle for painting, you're being as light as you can when it's over areas you've already painted to avoid doing any damage to these areas, and just make sure you've got a stable grip on it the entire time. Now we're going to use Agrak Thurfshade thinned down with some Lamy medium and apply a nice thorough wash all over the brown feathers, letting it sink into the gaps between all the individual feathers and creating a nice sense of depth and tone across the main body. Now we're going to apply a nice heavy dry brush with the previous mix of Rhinox hide and Scrag brown all over the feathers, making sure the previous wash has dried thoroughly before we apply this to avoid any unsightly streaks or blemishes. We recommend going against the grain of the feathers to really help catch all the edges and make this look as realistic and thorough as we possibly can. Now we're going to start adding Cadian flesh tone to the previous Rhinox hide and Scrag brown mix and start applying this as a slightly lighter dry brush over the previous layer. The Cadian flesh tone is a bit of an odd choice for highlighting, but we found it brought up the tone of the brown really nicely, really naturally, and gave a really nice look to the feathers once we finished this stage. We continue to add Cadian flesh tone in a few increments, making our dry brushing layers lighter and lighter for each successive highlight stage. By the point at which you're ready to move on to the final highlight stage, your mix should contain no more than 75% Cadian flesh tone, or 3 parts Cadian flesh tone to 1 part the original Rhinox hide Scrag brown mix. Now for the final highlight stage, we're going to add in some Kislev flesh to the overall Rhinox hide, Scrag brown and Cadian flesh tone mix, and apply this as a feather-like dry brush just over all the brown feathers we've already done, going against the grain as we have been previously, just to pick out the absolute edges and most pronounced areas of feather and create a nice sense of light hitting off the main body of this majestic eagle. Now we're going to create a glaze with Seraphim Sepia, mixed down significantly with Lamia Medium, and just apply this all over the body of the eagle, just to tie in all the highlight and layer stages, and just get a little bit more richness to the feathers that aren't so pronounced. We can use a mix of Zandri dust with a little bit of Rhine oxide mixed in as well, and we're going to very carefully just base coat the head and the neck feathers that transcend onto the main bulk of the body with this mix, being careful to leave the beak still showing the undercoat underneath. With the neck feathers you can carefully start feathering in to the brown of the body we've already done, and this will help create a nice transition between the brown and the beigey colours once we're ready with the highlighting stages. Now we're going to add some talon sand to the Zandri dust Rhine oxide mix and just apply this again as an all over layer to the head and the neck feathers. Make sure with both these stages to get right up underneath the beak as well, so we get all the facial area covered. Now we're going to apply a wash again with Agrax Earthshade Thin Down Lamia Medium just to tone this back down and help it blend into the main bulk of the brown feathers. So just give a nice little bit of shade and texture to the recessed areas of face and the neck feathers as well. Once the wash is dry, we're going to increase the amount of talon sand in the previous layer mix and apply this as a heavy dry brush as we did with the brown of the feathers all over the head and neck. You can work this towards the edge of the neck feathers as well, which will just help to create that blend between the head colour and the main bulk of the brown body, and will stop the contrast looking too stark. Now we're going to apply a lighter dry brush all over these areas with pure talon sand. Being very careful at this stage, we don't want to get any unsightly streaks with the dry brush over the main bulk of the eagle's head. Finally, we're going to apply a very light dry brush with a 50-50 mix of talon sand and pallid witch flesh, once again just to pick out the most pronounced areas of detail and create the fearsome, majestic expression on this winged beast. We used a mix of Abaddon Black mixed with a little bit of Storm Vermin Fur, and we base coated all the feathers that run up along the back of the wings and along the tailbone itself. The Storm Vermin Fur is slightly brown in hue and will complement nicely with the rest of the browns we've used for the main bulk of the eagle once we've got through to the layering and highlighting stages. You want to keep this mix quite dark as we don't want it to be too light, because then otherwise we won't have the transition between shadow and light once we get through to the following stages. Be very careful as well not to bleed out onto any of the feathers we've already finished. Now we're going to increase the amount of Storm Vermin Fur in the mix and apply a nice heavy dry brush to all these black feathers. We concentrated the heavy dry brush towards the edges of the feathers, and later on we went along with a smaller dry brush and just worked the mix into the feathers that meet up with the brown feathers towards the inner of the wing, just so we avoided any potential for spillage over onto any of the finished parts of the eagle. Now we apply the slightly lighter dry brush next with pure Storm Vermin Fur. Once again, working your way against the grain of the feathers to make sure we pick out as much of the detail as we possibly can. Being very careful whilst you're doing this to maintain a very light but firm grip on the eagle so it doesn't go flying out of your hands as it did a couple of times with us. Finally, we're going to apply a feather-like dry brush just with Dawnstone, which will just pick out the very edges of the feathers as we have with the main body and the head and neck feathers so far. Now we're going to use XV88 and just very carefully pick out the beak at the front of the head, making sure we get all the crease of the mouth as well as the underside of the beak without bleeding too much over onto the finished head. It's very important to work out where the beak is compared to the neck feathers. Now we're going to use a mix of XV88 and Baylor Brown and just layer this over the base coat. Do this in a couple of thin coats so we get a nice smooth finish. The beak is very sharp and very dangerous and it needs to look menacing, so any blemishes will not do at this stage. Now we're going to apply a wash with Seraphim Sepia mixed with a little bit of Lamy Medium just to add a bit of tone to the beak and the mouth. Once the wash is dry, we're going to layer over all the beak now with pure Baylor Brown, leaving the wash showing in the recesses, around the crease of the mouth, the nostrils in the beak, and then the other recessed areas. Now we're going to add some pallid witch flesh into the Baylor Brown and apply this as a highlight all over the beak just to pick out some more of the pronounced areas, leaving the Baylor Brown showing in the recesses alongside the wash we applied earlier on. Just help create a nice little shine to the very edge of the beak and make it look nice and menacing and a real threat for any orcs who dare oppose this great beast. Finally, we increase the amount of pallid witch flesh in the Baylor Brown mix to an approximate 50-50 split and just applied a very fine highlight down the front of the beak and around the mouth just to frame it a little bit more and give it that real sense of sharpness. Finally, we applied a very thin glaze of Agrak Surshade just to tile these layers together. Now we very carefully picked out the recessed eye holes with Abaddon Black. And once we're happy with that, we then filled in the pupils by painting 2 small dots of pallid witch flesh either side to create the eyes. Using Mournfang Brown, carefully apply a base coat to all the feet and the talons. Make sure we get in all the creases between the pads, all the way around each of the individual toes, and all around the ankle. Now we're going to use pure Scrag Brown and layer over the feet again, just to get a nice authentic look to our eagle's feet, which doesn't look too orangey, but still pays homage to his beastly kind. Now apply a wash with Agrak Surshade, thin down with Lamy Medium once again, just to create some definition between all the pads and joins in the feet. Now we're going to use a mix of Scrag Brown mixed with Deathclaw Brown, and we're going to very carefully layer over all the areas on the feet, leaving the wash showing in as many of the recessed areas as we can. The feet are very well defined, they've got very well defined pads and individual knuckle joints, so it's very easy to work out where this layer stage needs to go at this point. Just very carefully work your way around all 360 degrees of each toe, and also picking out the ribbing on the very top of each talon nice and carefully. Now we're going to use pure Deathclaw Brown and just push the transition between the darker and lighter areas a little bit further by applying this as a highlight over the Scrag Brown Deathclaw Brown mix, keeping our highlight slightly tighter, slightly neater than we were previously to create a nice smooth transition. And we're going to use a mix of Deathlord Brown mixed with pallid witch flesh, and just apply this as a dot and edge highlight over the most pronounced areas of each of the toes, the ankle joint, and all the ribbing on top of the feet. Now we're going to very carefully just go back over each of the individual claws on each foot and paint these in with Abaddon Black. Now we're going to apply a coat of Citadel Technical Paint Hard Coat just over each of the individual claws, which will dry nice and glossy and give them a real characteristic sharpness. Usually we sand and spray the base at the same point we spray the model, but unfortunately, as this is a flying stand and needs to be transparent, we've had to do this afterwards. The base was covered in fine modelling sand affixed to it with PVA glue, being careful not to get any of the glue or sand up the main shaft of the translucent stand the eagle will be standing on. Then we used a diluted mix of Abaddon Black with Lamy and Medium and painted on our base coat onto the sand once it was fully dry. The base was then dry brushed in 3 stages, using dryad bark for the base of our brown earth, followed by Gwaihir brown over top, a slightly lighter dry brush, and finally followed by a very light dusting of pallid witch flesh over the top, which will just pick out the most pronounced areas of base and finish off our base. Our base was then decorated with midland tufts, dead leaves and clump foliage, just to finish off the look for our eagle. As you can see, the streaks in the glue on the base have made some quite effective claw marks in the sand, where it looks like the eagle is taken off from on its way to attend to its business in Middle Earth. Happy little accident. And there we have it, our great eagle, finished and ready to fly to the aid of any who need it in Middle Earth. A majestic sight soaring the skies amongst its kin.